The following is my conversation with David Trimble. David Trimble is a highly experienced events coordinator originally from Alaska. He is best known probably for the Red Hook Criterium Championship Series and the Midnight Half, which became both internationally renowned as innovative and unique competitions. The Red Hook Crit actually grew to become such an important cultural event that it was archived by the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History. For people that were there, they understand how big the Red Hook Crit got for the cycling business. It was really unique, but really innovative. You'll hear the story of the Red Hook Crit and kind of David's journey, how his passion and how his unique skill set was able to create such a kind of cultural phenomenon. That's what the best way to describe it. I've known David since 2013, thanks to some time that we spent working together on the Red Hook Criterium. I was consulting with Cinelli, and Cinelli was one of the main sponsors of the event. So we know each other pretty well. David Trimble, so thank you so much for coming on today.
Great. Thanks for having me, Wyatt.
Yeah, we know each other for a long time. We've seen lots of battles together. Hopefully see lots more together.
Had some battles with each other.
Had some battles with each other. Yeah, maybe one or two. They say that the sign of a good friendship is, to sometimes have some conflict. So that means you're being honest. So yeah, can we just start with your background? Tell me about where you're from and kind of, I know you've got a huge family and you moved around a lot. Can you just give me a quick overview of where you're from and about your family?
Yeah, sure. I'm 40 years old, so getting old. I'm originally from Alaska, Anchorage, Alaska, and I grew up in various parts of the United States. I lived in Boston, I lived in Arkansas, I lived in Texas, and then when I was in my early 20s, I moved to New York City, lived there.
Why were you moving?
The rest.
Sorry, why were you moving? Why were you guys moving around so much?
I had a lot of siblings. I was one of eight kids, and every time the family grew, there was some new life situation that required us to move. So it was a pretty wild childhood, I think. I lived in each place for 5 or 6 years as a kid, and got different perspectives, I think, on different parts of the United States. But I really feel like my life kind of started when I moved to New York City in 2006 when I was 23 years old.
And we'll talk about that. You have a particular love for New York. Is that fair?
Love-hate relationship like anyone. And actually right now I'm living in Girona, Spain. I'm kind of splitting my time between New York and in Europe. And yeah, I mean, New York City's wild and amazing and really a tough place to live also.
So 8 siblings. Where are you in the 8?
I'm the second oldest. There's 4 boys, 4 girls. Yeah, I had I never thought my childhood was that crazy until I got older, and now I have my own kid, and now looking back at it, I'm like, wow, that was actually pretty interesting childhood. I was homeschooled for many years as a kid. So I was a bit sheltered in that sense. Didn't go to public school until I was in 8th grade. With so many siblings, you're just kind of figuring stuff out on your own. So it's always having to be really independent and really creative as a kid to try to figure out how to get through life.
Yeah, but to have 8, okay, so homeschooling and 8 siblings, I mean, to me, it makes me think that you had a lot of, I mean, at least in my experience, to have a lot of siblings, you do actually gain a lot of confidence, I guess, just because you're around people, you feel I don't know, protected. Is that the experience you had?
Yeah, maybe not protected, but you're always having to negotiate things and manage your siblings, and like if you had to fight over resources, so you're always trying to just figure out how to make things work to your advantage.
Right. But I guess at least your siblings are on your, at the end of the day, they are your siblings as opposed to, the outside world, which,
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's a closed environment, and everyone is on the same team.
yeah. And
Yeah, it was amazing. It was amazing and interesting childhood.
your dad worked, maybe you can help me understand his history in cycling.
Yeah, so both my father James and my uncle Brent actually started building bicycles in Alaska in the late 70s and early 80s. They were engineers and architects and tinkerers and inventors, and they got into cycling as young adults, and then they started actually building their own frames. They experimented a lot with the early composite materials like Kevlar and fiberglass, and they actually invented the kind of the modern monocoque molding system for composite frames. So
Like
yeah,
in a vacuum, or were they working with any sort of like companies at the time?
in a vacuum, yeah, by them, they actually used a vacuum bag to create these two-piece mold that was able to create a one-piece composite frame. Yeah, they were really just like figuring things out in their garage in Alaska.
Just out of a hobby, or did they have some sort of a plan behind all of this?
It started out as a hobby, and then it became, for both of them, they kind of went their separate ways. My uncle Brent, he ended up founding a company called Kestrel, which became very influential in the composite bicycle world. And then my father kind of went on his own and did his own business building bicycles, under the Trimble. It was a Trimble Aero bike that was his product. And they both were very successful and made it pretty far. But in the end, their bikes were ahead of their time and were banned by the UCI because they didn't look like a traditional tubed frame, and they just weren't. In the end, they weren't able to turn it into a major commercial success. But their influence is still seen in cycling design.
Sure. And were you around your uncle and your dad doing this stuff? Were you able to see this and be part of it at all?
Yeah, I grew up at my dad's shop while he was building frames, and after his bikes were banned from traditional cycling events, it was mostly professional triathletes who were using them. And so I just grew up going to triathlons every weekend and just always being around cycling and running and triathlons.
And then I know that you became interested in motorsports as well, where you were doing karting. Is that correct? Is that the next step kind of in your path towards racing and events?
Correct. Yeah. So I never, partly it was just my environment, like where I grew up in the US, there wasn't, the roads were not safe for cycling. There was no cycling culture. So I never actually got interested in cycling myself as a kid. And instead I got very interested in motorsports. I started racing go-karts when I was 12 years old. I raced go-karts all the way through high school at a fairly high level. I was racing what they called the SCUSA professional tour at the time, that with races all over North America and the US, Mexico, and Canada. And my dream was to become a Formula One driver. So everything I cared about was just centered around, what it took to become a professional race car driver. And obviously, I didn't come from a super wealthy family. It was crazy expensive sport, and at some point,
sure,
when you have to graduate out of karts and into cars, into like Formula 3 or Formula 2, or one of the latter series up into Formula 1. I didn't have the money to do it, so I actually started working as a mechanic on race car teams. And then I did that, for my late teens, early 20s. I was working as a mechanic on IndyCar teams. So I was doing the pit stops and working, just like traveling around the world, going to these huge motorsports events. That's where I think I started first soaking up the atmosphere of what a racing event should be.
So IndyCar, can you help people understand maybe that aren't from the US what IndyCar is?
Yeah, so at the time it was IndyCar had split into two series. IndyCar is basically like the North American equivalent of Formula One. They're open wheel cars. They go super fast, like 250 miles per hour. The Indy 500 is
The
the
most
biggest
famous.
sporting event, the biggest single day sporting event in the world. And yeah, so I was working actually as a mechanic in that series. So high, multi-million dollar budgets, races all over the world, super high pressure. I was doing that when most kids were in university.
So you just like, what did you do? You just walked, like, called up these teams and said, "Hey, I want to work for you guys," or how did you get into that?
Well, people knew me from go-kart racing, and people were expecting me that I would actually become a driver, but I didn't have the money. So they're like, okay, well, just come work for a bit till you figure out your sponsorship situation, and then you can hopefully get a seat and actually start driving and racing. I was never able to figure out the finances, so I just gained experience and year after year, like worked my way up from lower level teams to the highest professional teams.
Okay. And these IndyCar events, you said you were a mechanic. Would that have been like, I mean, you learned all of the ins and outs of the technical side of these vehicles? Like, you were pretty able to
Yeah.
work on these cars, like pretty did you have a certain specification that you knew about, or did you kind of know everything? I have a hard time understanding how like if there are different types of mechanics.
Yeah, at that level, I mean, I started out, so there's all different levels in motorsports. There's like the top level, which is Indy cars, and at that level, each car has like 20, 30 mechanics working on it. And yeah, you do kind of get put on one part of the car, and that's your specialty. Then there's lower level series, like there was a series called Formula BMW and Formula Renault and a Formula Mazda, and those are lower level series. And usually those series they have like one or two mechanics per car. And I started out in the lower series and I worked my way up into IndyCar. And in the lower series, you're responsible for everything. You have to do all the work on the car with
Sure.
maybe between you and one other person. And as you grow up into the bigger teams, your work is more specialized and more divided. You learn on the job, and you have there's people been doing it their whole lives and they're yelling at you and putting a lot of pressure on you to do it
Of
right.
course. Of course.
And it's super high pressure, super like, you'd have to change an engine in less than an hour and everything had to be perfect. And there's millions of dollars on the line. Yeah, it was super high pressure environment.
It sounds like an amazing world. Why did you leave?
I didn't like the culture of the motorsports culture in the end as I started discovering myself and growing up. The very macho culture, very like, yeah, just there's a lot of like alcoholics in it. Like all the mechanics who had been doing it their whole life. You're always traveling. You're always under huge
Sure.
stress. You can't
Yeah,
like
I get
have a
it.
stable home. I remember one year I traveled 300 days out of the year. So I felt like I was just missing a huge part of life. And
And you're about 21, 22 years old at that time?
correct, yeah, 21.
You're like, this is
Yeah,
not the life I want, is what you said to yourself.
yeah, yeah. When you looked at the guys who were like, the crew chiefs and the bosses, and you saw what their lifestyle is like, you're like, I don't want to be you. So
I
I
get it.
decided to step away from it.
And you decided to move to New York.
Yeah, so I moved to New York. I have an uncle who has an architecture firm there, and I basically started interning there. With my experience in motorsports, I had a lot of mechanical skills, and he was a very hands-on designer, so he would kind of manage his projects. He would manage the construction as well as the design, and he was able to use my skills, my problem solving and mechanical skills to like kind of finish his projects and work on construction issues. And I moved to New York City and started working for him.
Like reading blueprints, looking over designs, just kind of doing what you could.
Yeah, I wasn't reading blueprints or involved in the design so much. It's more like when a project was almost finished and there's tons of small little projects to finish
Sure.
before the client can move in. and a lot of like the contractors were already off the jobs, but there might be like a custom chandelier that needed to be hung or some custom door hardware that had to be installed. And I would come in and finish the project. Like,
Construction.
take it all the way.
Construction.
Well, they call it a punch list, where like the construction, the main construction's done, and you're working on the small finishing details. It was almost like getting the race car ready for the race. You're like, the car is built, but you got to do all these last minute tasks to make it perfect. And that's what I was doing on these architecture projects in New York.
And so it sounds like you began to settle into New York, to see New York. And this is what you said earlier. You're like, you started to really kind of think, man, this is a cool place. I like it here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, but right before I moved to New York, I was living in Texas. I had started riding bikes for fun in Texas. Had actually started racing mountain bikes. And so when I moved to New York City, I had already started getting involved in cycling a bit, but I wasn't that serious about it. And then when I moved to New York City, I kind of fell into the cycling culture there, and I started really becoming interested in it. And I'd been around racing my whole life since I was 12 years old, just being at races every single weekend, and I really missed the atmosphere of the events. And in architecture, everything moves really slow, where at a sporting event, everything is very immediate, and I really missed it. So I think that's what drove me to get really involved in cycling, just to be able to go to these racing events.
So let's give people some context. So we're talking 2005, 2006.
2006, yeah.
2006. Correct. And so you kind of have an interest in cycling, but cycling was kind of going through a bit of a renaissance, I guess, for track bikes and for just kind of a style rejuvenation of the sport. Is that a fair assessment?
I'm not sure if it had totally started yet at that point. There was this underground cycling world in New York City that was spearheaded by like bike messenger culture.
Messengers. Yep.
Yeah, and they really had a vibrant community with super interesting races, like there's a race called Monster Track, which Bronx and Broadway Bombing. And
do you want to explain what Monster Track is to people that don't know?
Yeah, Monster Track's an alley cat. That's the format. In this alley cat particular, you had to ride a brakeless track bike, so a fixed gear brakeless track bike, and then the format is there's just checkpoints throughout the city, and you have to complete the checkpoints as fast as you can. Whoever finishes all the checkpoints wins, and it's open traffic, no closed roads.
It's insane.
It's very intense, yeah. But it's also like the most fun thing you've ever done in your life. The first time I ever rode a brakeless track bike was actually the morning of Monster Track, where I had a fixed gear commuter bike, but I always had a front brake on it. I took the brake off the morning of the race, jumped in, and I was in pretty good shape for mountain bike racing. And then I was racing with the lead pack up 2nd Avenue, and it was like the most exciting thing I had ever done. And that's saying a lot coming from go-kart racing, where those races are also very intense and very fast.
So you're doing
got me excited. Yeah.
And so you kind of, at that point, did you say, there's something here, there's something that I think can be, I mean, you're probably thinking to yourself, I'd love to be able to do this and, use my experience, but this was pretty early and you didn't know how at that point.
Yeah, I didn't really I had no ambitions. I just wanted to race and have fun and be a part of this community. And at the same time, there was a lot about alley cats I didn't like, especially coming from motorsports, where things are very precise and it's a really well, figured out and organized sport. A lot of the alley cats were kind of rigged. Like the organizers would change the rule at the last minute to let their friends win, or there's always a fight afterwards, who actually won the race, and rampant cheating, and it was the most corrupt kind of racing you can imagine. So I was always really frustrated, because I actually won a couple of races and then was disqualified afterwards just for some arbitrary reason. So that I started getting kind of frustrated on the alley cat scene. And at the same time, I started racing like traditional cycling events, like road races. New York City has this huge like road racing scene, and I like those events in a sense because your like fitness and your strength and your skill as a bike racer like made the difference. And when you won a race, you like actually won the race. You crossed the finish line first, and no one disqualified you or like made up some rules afterwards.
Right.
But the those events had no atmosphere. Like the events were super boring. There was no one. There was no spectators. No creativity. So I was like kind of dabbling in both worlds and not totally satisfied in either of them.
And so, as people who know you kind of know where we're going, but people that don't, there was a race that you organized for your birthday.
Yes. So yeah, as I became more involved in the cycling scene, and I was going to races literally like every week. I would be at an event, some kind of event. So I started thinking that I'm going to put on my own event. Just that was almost like something everyone in the community did. Everyone like raced, but then a lot of most people also had their own little event. And I actually had an idea to do an architecture themed alley cat for my birthday. That was kind of my first idea. And then I was super busy at work, and I was like, oh, it's gonna be too much work, and it's gonna be too complicated. And I also had a lot of friends who weren't cyclists, and I wanted to have an actual birthday party where my friends who weren't cyclists would come. And that's where I conceived the idea of the first Red Hook Crit, where I would take some elements from the bike messenger races. The main element I took was that the race was going to use a fixed gear bike with no brakes. And then I took some elements from road racing, which was the Criterium format. There were some Criteriums at the time in New York City that were kind of the biggest road racing events, or the crit called Grant's Tomb. That was always really important. So I took elements from each side and then combined it for this event around my birthday party.
And where was the first race? Was it in there at on the pier?
It was in Red Hook. I was living in Red Hook at the time, and Red Hook at the time was very quiet. There was barely anyone living there at night. I would often come home late at night and like come home from a party or a race, and I'd be on my track bike, and I would just like do a couple extra laps around the neighborhood and ride full speed. And I realized there's like never any traffic there, and I could just make a short racetrack around a few blocks, and then if you did it late enough, like no one was going to mess with you.
And this was in the neighborhood.
In the neighborhood, yeah. Like
okay.
the start finish line of the first Red Hook Crit was literally right outside my door. Like you open the front door. It was on Van Dyke Street.
Van Dyke, sorry, Van Dyke.
Yeah, Van Dyke and Richards was the first start finish line, and then looped down to Beard Street and then cobblestone, went around the Red Hook farm. And, it was just a short, like 1 kilometer lap with a bunch of corners around Red Hook.
But you had, so just for people that don't know, Red Hook is a part of Brooklyn, kind of towards the south of Brooklyn, which at the time was sort of where a lot of younger people were living. It still probably is, but this is like in 2008, 2007, was it?
Well, yeah, it's like a peninsula that was post-industrial. So there actually wasn't any young people living there. There's like not that many people living there at all.
Oh, okay.
It was like warehouses and mostly warehouses, like bus depot, like a dilapidated grain terminal. And I lived there because another uncle of mine had a wood shop, and he had like a spare room in his wood shop that I lived in because it was really cheap. That's how I ended up. It was just like an out of the sorts neighborhood.
And so I guess to get some context, where were you finding this community? Was this just community that you had sort of built from racing mostly, or people that you had met in the years where you were working at the architecture firm?
Yeah, for the people who would actually take part in the race, I tried really hard it was actually at the beginning, it was really hard to convince people to race because it was like the bike messengers were like, oh, this race is too serious. It's not an alley cat. And the road racers are like, this event's dangerous and too crazy, and they didn't want to do it. So I was like trying to convince my friends on both sides, from the road racing side and from the bike messenger side, that they should both compete in it. And then I had a bunch of friends from the architecture world and just from outside of cycling that I wanted to come to my party. And I was trying to convince them to come to my party just to like drink and have a good time, that there'd be something exciting to watch. I was trying hard to sell it to everyone. And initially it was really small. Like the first event, I think, 20 people were racing, and there might have been like another 20 or 30 spectators, just really, really small and fun.
I remember you once said on an interview or somewhere, you talked about glory.
Right. Yeah.
You talked about glory, and you said, nobody wants to come to my birthday party. I'm paraphrasing it, but like, it was hard to get people to come to my birthday party, but if you gave them the opportunity at glory, they would come. Am I saying that right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, basically, yeah. So for the bike racers, like, yes, unless there's like a chance at personal glory, they weren't going to come to your party. So yeah, to give them that chance. If you give them that chance, they're going to be there.
Okay. Well, as long as they come. So let's kind of frame this. So you have this experience, you envision this little, at the time, crit, which crits are, obviously pretty popular road crits. And so you sort of just tweaked the crit concept and made it into a fixed gear race. And so the first year, 20 people watching, 20 people racing. And then the next year, I presume it was, people, you sort of got behind it a little more, and I guess I'm just trying to understand the trajectory, because we got a lot to talk about still. But we're only at the birthday party still. So can you give me some context on like how that, like, was it just something that sort of started to snowball year over year?
Yeah, it definitely snowballed. The format immediately was successful. It was super fun. Everyone who raced just like had the best time. And I raced myself for the first year, and I loved the format. It was just so much fun. So I knew I was kind of onto something. So every year I just put a little more effort into it. And each year I tried to like fix everything that had gone wrong the year before and do a little bit better job. And then it wasn't long before it started just getting really big. I mean, there's many hours of stories for each year on how it grew. But it basically started attracting press. Like the New York Times came and covered the second edition of it. And there's, being in New York City, there's all sorts of creatives like photographers and artists, and they kind of caught wind of it, because if you went and watched it, it was crazy. It was like on open streets, and it was dark. It was just very visually spectacular. So all these like amazing photographers were coming out and documenting it, and that just really just started snowballing, and people became aware of it.
And so you were kind of at that point, when did you kind of think, oh my God, I got a tiger by the tail here?
I think it wasn't until after the third year is when it started getting really big. The third year was like, all of a sudden there was like probably 1,000 people watching it. And way more athletes were taking part. We had like 100 athletes race the third year, and then we were still on open streets without permits, and it was really chaotic.
Yeah, I got to ask you that, like, personal liability, like, what was going through your mind, honestly?
I was young, and there was no money involved, so I didn't care. Like, I knew from like all the alley cats that like historically the organizers never got in trouble. So
okay,
I wasn't really worried about it.
You knew that you could kind of fly below the radar in case something happened.
Well, I didn't know that. I just didn't want to think about it.
Sure.
So I was young and just living in the moment. And I mean, the cops would come to the race, park their cars around the course, and actually cheer on the athletes. So
wow.
It wasn't like we wasn't hidden necessarily. It's just, it wasn't big enough to actually cause any issues. And once it became big enough to cause issues, then that's when I had to get more serious. Like before the fourth year, I approached the NYPD precinct in the area, and I inquired on how I could get permits to actually do it more legally. And first thing the detective said, he's like, "I've been looking for you." Like they were already planning on shutting it down that year because
Oh, sure.
they had seen how big it got the year before. So at
Okay.
that point, it was like, okay, do I keep doing it or do I stop and just like let it kind of fade away just because like I had reached the limit of what I could do with it.
Sure. And there are a lot of moments at that where you're kind of like, do I keep doing this? Or
Yeah, every race. Yeah.
every race.
But especially in that's the closest it ever went to stopping because we were told that we couldn't get permits. There's no way we could do it on the streets. Yeah, it was basically 2 weeks before the race and I had no idea where we were going to do the race. And I was super stressed out. I had secured the first ever sponsor, a company called Eastern Mountain Sports reached out to us. And they like loved the event and they were offering to help pay for it, actually give us money for the first time. And it was 2 weeks before the race and I had no idea where I was going to do the race. And I just like happened to go have lunch with a friend who worked for the New York City Economic Development Corporation. They controlled the Brooklyn cruise terminal. And she just like kind of randomly suggested like, oh, you should just do it at the cruise terminal. And then the rest is history.
Right, because the cruise terminal is it's a bigger location. There's like a big parking lot there. I think it's a parking lot.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a perfect place for a crit.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's off the city streets, not controlled by NYPD. It's controlled by the New York City, New Jersey Port Authority. And I just somehow had this random connection there. And it was the first time they'd ever used that space for an event. Yeah, I mean, I could write a book just about that process.
Right, and that was really close to where you were living.
Yeah, just 2 blocks away. I mean, it was such a good venue that later on in life, the FIA Formula E, like $50 million event was staged there for
That's right.
5 years, which I also worked on. Yeah, it was a pretty crazy turn of events. It's fate.
So you're putting on the first, so that was sort of the first kind of
legal event
breakthrough in terms of where you're like, wow, this could actually be a real thing. Like instead of just an underground, because alley cats are illegal. They're I've worked with these organizations. It's like there's 3 different people that say that they own it, and it's just a mess. And you're saying that at this point it was like, okay, I've got something that's actually, legal and could actually be a real interesting undertaking also for sponsors. So at this point, having like a real format, you did the first race and you're really starting to get some momentum. And I want to note that you have a really good sensibility about design and style, and you're very attentive to branding. I don't know where you got that, but you've always been very like attentive to who you partner with. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is the way that I've always seen it, that you've always wanted to build something like when you built this, which I don't even think we've even said the name. It's called the Red Hook Crit. The Red Hook Crit, you always had partners that had a certain style sensibility, that had sort of a positioning that brought value to the race. Am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, I don't think I think the partners were self-selecting in a way, just because the race was, like you said, like cool and stylish, and we paid attention to design, and I think those attracted the brands that also paid attention to design and their positioning. And yeah, I think I figured out from an early time that like, you're in New York City and there's so many options for events and everything's like, it's New York City. That's like all the best designers and photographers and like all the coolest people in the world are there. If you want to do something to attract those kinds of people, it has to be really unique. It can't just be a sporting event. It can't just be like a boring bike race. Like you have to have more than just that. And especially working in the design, architecture and design, aesthetics were super important. Being involved in art and photography and just being around a really creative community made me realize that like if you're going to promote a sporting event, it also has to include all those other elements.
Sure.
And I had a lot of luck. You know, I had friends that were super talented, creative that were able to like help me at the beginning of the race and grow it. The decade long partnership I had with Jonah Burns, who became the Red Hook creative director, and like
Sure.
super talented graphic designer, and we both had the same kind of aesthetic vision for what a sporting event could be, and just having these like super lucky breaks where I was partnering with the right people who could help promote the event in the way that fit my vision.
Yeah, and I remember in terms of partnerships, Castelli comes to mind. They were really committed. Steve Smith was committed to the event. Giro and Eric Richter was committed to the event. Antonio Colombo and Chinelli, of course.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the best partners were the ones that like we had such a strong vision for the way the race should look, like from a graphic design standpoint, that the brand that let us do the design and like trusted our vision were the ones that we had the most successful partnerships with. So we had all these cool brands we were partnering with, but we were doing all the work. And then looking back at it, like, man, we like did so much work for
yeah.
such little contribution.
Yes,
and we
you
made
did.
these.
Yes, you did.
We made these events like cool, or these brands like cool, but they were like, like, oh, we're going to give you custom helmets, we're going to give you custom bikes,
we'll
custom jerseys.
We give you some jerseys.
Like, oh, but we're doing all the work, and the work we're doing was amazing. But people really responded to it.
No, I mean, I was very deeply into it. We worked together because of my work with Chinelli, and you were growing, I was growing. I think we were, I'm a little older than you, but we were kind of both cutting our teeth at the time. And yeah, I mean, these are the types of things that you learn on the go. I mean, I was there with you.
Yeah.
I remember I saw you at the Barcelona event, and I was at the event. And after the race at the Barcelona, there's like a plaza there, and the race goes on. I think there's probably a couple hundred people there. I think it's like midnight or 12:30. Everything closes up. And I was about to go back to my hotel, and I came by and I said goodbye, and I'm looking at you and I'm like, oh my God, he's going to start like he's going to be here for the next 3 hours cleaning up. I was like, Jesus Christ, man.
Well, that's nothing. Yeah, that's nothing. Yeah. 3 hours. I remember the first time we had a really big crowd was the 2013 Red Hook Brooklyn, where I don't know, 10,000 people were there. And at that point, I like hadn't figured out that you actually need staff and infrastructure.
Oh, wow. So it was just you.
It was just me, and like the amount of trash that 10,000 people can produce in a couple hours is insane. And my friend Pavel and I, for 4 days, we worked 12 hours a day for 4 days after the event, just picking up trash.
You're kidding me. Oh my God.
So it was, there's a lot of learning, a lot of steep learning curve, because the event grew so quickly.
Tiger by the tail. Right. I keep thinking that analogy, right? I mean, that's what it was.
Yeah. But the good thing was I was super motivated to, whenever I made a mistake one year, I was super motivated to fix it the following year. It's like, I think really, good and bad. I was really self-critical. So it's something like, I didn't have enough trash cans. I like really was hard on myself. And next year I had the right amount of trash cans. Like, so I was just always improving the event as it was growing. And then I think that's what allowed me to take it to such a high level.
Sure. And I guess the next kind of, and then, there's so much here, but we can just hit the big ones. But so I remember the first year you had an event in Italy. How did that come about? Did you just like working somehow, you got in touch with Chinelli, and then you were just like, let's just do it in Italy? I mean, how did that come about? And
that's also a long story, but Chinelli loves overstating their importance on this event, which at the beginning they actually did very little. Actually, they almost always did very little. But it was the Bicycle Film Festival that was my first connection to Milan. I ended up in Milan with a friend who is an artist, and he was he had a painting in the Bicycle Film Festival art show, and I literally just went for fun and like no ambitions to bring the race there. I made a bunch of friends at the Bicycle Film Festival in Milan, and then through those friendships, we came up with the idea of bringing the Red Hook Crit there as a collateral event to the Bicycle Film Festival, and that was 2010. So the
Right.
race was still underground. That edition of Brooklyn was underground without permits, and the first edition in Milan was also underground without permits. And I was just doing it for the adventure. Like they're like, "Oh, let's do the race with the Bicycle Film Festival," and I was like, "Yeah, it sounds amazing. Let's do it." It wasn't part of a long-term strategy. I was really just on an adventure at the time. And then Chinelli was a sponsor of the Bicycle Film Festival at the time, and they like gave us a couple, caps or something. I remember they were a real minor sponsor of the event.
And so once you did kind of legitimize the event in 2013 and you had kind of dabbled in this collaboration with the Bicycle Film Festival, you kind of had an idea of how you could kind of run it both in Brooklyn and then also in Italy. And so you were doing Brooklyn, Milan, I think until 13. And then in 13, you added Barcelona as well, and like 2 races in
Yeah.
Brooklyn.
So the real big step for the Red Hook Crit was when we signed Rockstar Games as the title sponsor.
Was that in 13?
That was in 13. They had sponsored another road bike crit in New York called the Harlem Criterium, but they had, they've been paying attention to the Red Hook, and they realized how much more vibrant and how much bigger our crowd was and how much cooler our crowd was. And I became friends with one of their creative directors, and we negotiated the sponsorship. And then that's when I realized I could kind of pursue my vision for the race, my vision that had developed, which was turning the race into this global championship series, kind of like Formula One.
Right.
And with their support, I was able to, have more funding for the Brooklyn event. I was able to add a second event in Brooklyn at the Navy Yard, and then I was able to add Barcelona and also improve Milan. And then at that point, it was a global championship series with Rockstar support.
Sure. And then you really had the tiger by the tail, because you've got investors now, or was it just they were also investors in the event?
At that point, they were
sponsors,
title sponsor, but they, the cost is still very low, especially for a company like that. And I was really operating these events on just the tiniest budget.
Right.
Compared to how big they were, it was insane how small our budgets were. So they're, they could do 4 events around the world for like the cost of like a fancy dinner, basically.
Yeah.
Now it's just like working for free, and like at that point I didn't even I had an office, but I didn't have an apartment. I was like sleeping on the floor of my office. It was just making it work no matter what.
This was all fueled by your vision.
Yeah. I don't know. I became obsessed with this event and taking the event as far as I could. I just lived and breathed it for.
Were you by yourself, or did you have someone with you?
I was, mostly by myself. I had, collaborators, people that helped me around the events, but day-to-day operations, throughout the whole year, I was just by myself doing it.
And all that pressure and all that stress and everything, is that just something that you're able to handle pretty? Because I've seen you and I've been to a lot of events, and I've seen you, and you're very, like, if there's anything, you're focused, you have a vision, and you're sometimes a bit stubborn, but I guess the whole, like, all the stress that is involved with that, how did you manage all that?
Yeah, I don't know. Looking back on it, it's hard to believe how much stress I put up with for, especially like when you're older, money is like so much more important. And back then I really was not making any money.
And you didn't care.
I didn't care. I just like, I had this like, if I build the race to a point, it's like going to make money. Maybe, I don't know.
It was an investment.
Yeah. And I just really wanted to make the best possible race. Like that's all I really cared about, was like, I wanted to make whenever there was a problem with the race, I just wanted to fix it and make it better and always improve it. I always had like endless ideas on how to improve it. It wasn't even close to what my vision was for it. So always had this huge motivation to keep pushing it further and further down the road. But yeah, it was, super stressful. I think I have PTSD from it actually. Like
Wow.
sometimes I wake up with dreams about like the worst possible things happening. And
Sure.
bad things did happen, really bad crashes and logistical problems and money problems.
Thankfully, nothing terrible, nothing tragic or anything, but yeah, there were some bad things. I know there was.
So
And so going through, I know that the race continued to grow, and then, at a certain point, you guys kind of just, it didn't make sense anymore. I know that you had to kind of
yeah,
close
yeah,
things close things
yeah,
down.
yeah. The event
And
got to the point where it was just it became a professional sporting event, but it didn't have a professional budget. So
right. And so it was like there was a gap between what it needed in terms of fuel and what
yeah,
the world was willing to give it. Right.
yeah, exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, there's a pretty big delta between,
Sure.
and the pressure, like people were really like taking this event seriously.
Yeah. I
Athletes,
mean, they have to
teams, and
produce.
sponsors.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like any tiny problem in the organization became this huge problem, and yeah, I was just like putting out fires constantly, but still not making any money, and people.
Right. Right. It has to be profitable for it to
Yeah,
survive.
and we're basically at the point where the marketing value was limited because the events were huge amount of spectators, huge amount of social media engagement, but for a professional sporting event to really make money, it's got to be like many times bigger than that. It has to be televised. It has to be seen
Sure.
by millions and millions of people. And the cost, I think the Red Hook Crit would have worked really well as a true professional sporting event, but the cost to get to that point was like many more times the budget we actually had.
It was a startup. It was a startup at the end of the day, right? I mean, it was like you had this startup, you had some funding, you're trying to make it work, you're trying to get some seed investment, you're trying to, make your monthly payroll or whatever. And at the end of the day, it didn't make sense, which, like anything, it happens. But one thing that I remember that was sort of a momentum booster that I wanted to talk about was your sensibility to the design aspect of it, but how social media contributed to the popularity of the event, because you arrived at the moment, like in 2013, when a lot of brands didn't know how to use social media, and you guys, for whatever reason, having that sensibility, were able to we're like light years ahead of all brands. And so you guys did have like this kind of, I don't know, head start. But
yeah,
now,
I think I got lucky with the emergence of social media, kind of coincided with the Red Hook Crit becoming popular. And I never cared about social media. I really don't care about it now. But at the time, I had, I had a certain way I wanted to communicate the event. It wasn't traditional sports marketing. It wasn't press releases or
right, because you couldn't, that wasn't sustainable.
Yeah, I didn't have the money to hire PR firms, and even
Nope.
when I did do that, like their work was just so traditional and boring, and I could really promote the race with my voice and my vision with social media. I always said that like if you look at an event on social media and it looks cool on social media, you need to go to that event and it has to be like actually 10 times cooler than it looked on social media. And that's why the Red Hook Crit social media worked, because social media was great. It was curated well and had good photography and good design. But you would see that and it would attract you to the event. And then when you're at the event was amazing.
Totally.
I feel like
those guys.
Lots of events, they seem cool on social media, and you go there and you're like, oh, actually, it's like, it's actually not that exciting. And the social media like oversells it. I think the Red Hook Crit, the social media didn't even come close to actually selling how exciting the event really was.
And through all this, you became, you grew as an organizer, as a negotiator, as in a lot of different ways. And so after you walked you that the event was ended, you've
Yeah.
been now doing consulting, and I mean, it makes obvious sense that you would be a consultant and you would be kind of an organizer for events. So you've
Yeah.
done in the past few years, you've done, because this was when the last event was in 17,
18.
18. Okay.
Yeah.
And since then you've been doing events consulting, right?
Yeah, I did. I mean, in the end, Red Hook Crit, we took a break at the end of 2018, and then COVID hit, so it was actually kind of great timing to
Right.
take a break from it. And then I worked as I took some of the momentum from the race. I worked on the 6-day cycling series, like the traditional track cycling series. Like I had a series of like running alley cats in New York City called the Midnight Half that I organized, and I went back to work for my uncle's architecture firm for a period, and more recently, I've been doing consulting for Nike around some of their races and some of their marathon events in New York City. So I still have a lot to give to the cycling and running and sports world, and just kind of looking for the right projects at the moment.
Yeah, no, well, I'm excited to see what's next. I know that you're married now, or
Married, yeah,
not
married.
have a daughter?
Yeah, have a daughter, 4.5-year-old daughter. Yeah, I mean, life's a lot different now than
It
the
is
early day,
from the guy
early
that
days. Yeah,
from the guy that was risking his life to run illegal races.
yeah. I mean, the good news is I have a lot more experience. I've seen a lot. I've seen how like the smallest, most underground races become successful, and I've also worked on like super high budget, world class sporting events, and I've seen how they operate. And, I think I'm a lot older and wiser, but maybe more risk adverse now. And that's also a barrier to get through. And the world's just different now as well. It's I feel like everything's fueled by private equity and venture capitalist funding, and everyone wants a huge return for little cost. And I think it's harder for an event like an underground event to grow like the Red Hook Crit grew back in the day.
Yeah, I mean, man, it was sort of a moment in time.
Yeah. Now like influencers want to get paid. You want to like someone to promote your event on social media, you got to like pay them like huge amounts of money, and everything's just so commodified.
Sure.
It's
No,
really
no.
hard to find things that actually have the kind of passion and community and like intrigue of the Red Hook Crit. Like you see people when people put on fixed gear events now, it feels like a marketing exercise more than an actual real community event.
Yeah, I mean, they have to pay the bills though.
Yeah. So I always said that I was like the Red Hook Crit wasn't able to fulfill its like true spirit. I was just going to stop doing it, and that's what happened. Like
Right.
I wasn't able to take that step to commercialize it to the point where it was going to be profitable without like stripping it of what made it valuable.
And so you live in Girona now
Yes.
with your wife and your daughter.
Yeah. It's life is good here.
Yeah, no, I'm glad you're in Europe. We got on the same time zone now. I can reach you.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, so to kind of wrap things up, maybe you can just kind of let people know. So you said that you are doing consulting, and if people want to like events, brands, that kind of thing, what types of consulting are you looking at now?
Oh well, yeah. I mean, I have ambitions to relaunch my own events. There's
You
always this
do?
dream to, yeah,
Okay.
there's always this dream to bring Red Hook Crit back with the right partners. It's always
Okay.
there. Whether or not it'll actually happen is remains to be seen. But I have ambitions to organize a series of like really high level running event. I feel like there's a lot of potential there, and then I'm also just available as a consultant for anyone in this world that needs my expertise.
Sure. And you're in and being in Europe now, it's a bit more flexible for any of the European races.
Yeah, Europe. I mean, I've been traveling my whole life for sporting events, so
Okay.
gonna continue.
So where can people get in touch with you?
I think the best is to check out my website. I have a portfolio website I'm launching this week, which is david-trimble.com.
Okay. I'll put the link in the notes. Well, cool, man. Thank you so much. I'm really glad you're doing well. We've known each other a while, and I really appreciate you coming on. Glad we got to hang out and talk, and hopefully see each other in real life soon.
Yeah, I'm sure we will. It's only the beginning of my career, so I'm excited for the next steps.
All right, man. Thank you again.
All right, thanks.